Well, well, well. Test, test. Well, I guess the question is, can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you smell me? I hope not. Well, can you? Can you? Test, test. I don't know. We'll see. That is good. Hey, Britain, how are you doing? Now, almost like 2.5 hours later? Something like that. I guess it's time to do the thing that I always do, which is open a beer. I hope you're having a great Saturday evening, and it's not sad for you that you have nothing better to do than to sit in front of a computer and watch me rambling, I guess. And I hope that the internet is going to be kind to me because I've been having like issues, tech issues for a while now. We'll see how that goes. Well, hey, biggest, how you doing? Gotten over your great German shock of yesterday? I hope so. And well, cheers. Hey, Jen. I assume that was sarcastic, and YouTube did not, in fact, notify you. I hope you're doing good. Funny thing is that whenever I go live, I get an email from YouTube telling me that someone is going live on my channel right now, and I'm like, yeah, it's me. But it's one of those fun things that make no sense whatsoever, and I guess we just have to live with that. Well, we'll see how that goes. I mean, it's January, it's the end of January, and people have better things to do, I assume. So I guess this will be a cozy and calm one. How has your month been so far? How has the year been so far for you guys? I hope it's been interesting and entertaining. And I'll, double check from time to time that the internet has not died on me. I hope it works. So far, it hasn't, and I'll just ignore the messages that this weird streaming service is sending me all the time because they know shit. They know less than Jon Snow, and that's quite hard to do. Yeah, that sounds good, Britain. Britain invited me and Dr. Philip Chase for a conversation on the question of whether fantasy is literature earlier today. So that was recorded earlier today and will be up on Britain's channel, Some OK Dude, on Friday-ish, I think. So keep an eye out for that one. I'll share it when it is up, and if you haven't, subscribed to Britain yet, you might want to do that. He's a nice guy. He's also in the chat right now, as you may have noticed. Why do you think like a surreal fever dream already? What happened to you in between? Yeah, the inevitable fascist coup of America. Yeah, how's Texas doing so far? Um, to be fair, Germany has also, we're also having issues with our fascists. It's a general thing right now, and it's the usual problem with, the right is rising, and liberals and sort of non-fascist conservatives or self-declared non-fascist conservatives are willing to let it just go, and the usual problem. Yeah, I guess it'll take a while for you to overcome the whole club issue. Biggest, I hope it'll happen at some point. Hey, Jeroen, how you doing? How's Radix treating you so far? Has it gotten more psychedelic? Um, I'm fashionable. I'm not sure if I'm fashionably late. I don't know. Hey, Joe, how you doing? Yeah, thank you for the compliment. I'm very much in love with that beret. I bought it last year for a project, and then I realized that it's I actually enjoy wearing it far more than a mere prop for a stupid video stunt would justify. So now I'm wearing it wherever I can. Because it's an officially made in the Basque country kind of beret, so it's as non-French as a French product can be. So yeah, Friday, a conversation between Britain and Philip Chase and me on fantasy and stuff, and I managed to mention Martin Luther and Adorno, so I don't have to take off the beret, I guess. But it was a fun conversation and nice to be back and have talks about stuff. What do you mean unhinged? You haven't seen me unhinged yet, mate. I'm still very hinged. Unhanged, yeah, definitely unhanged so far. No, it'll be up on Britain's channel. Philip was just a guest, a mere guest. So it'll be up on Friday, according to Britain. Yeah, so that's all I have right now, and I guess it's time to talk about stuff that happened over the last couple of weeks. How's the how's the new year of writing treating you guys? Both Britain and Joe. I saw both of you hanging out on Britain's channel last night when you were celebrating Britain's first year on BookTube. Ugh. Which, yeah, happy BookTube birthday, belated BookTube birthday on that one too. So yeah, how's the new year treating you guys so far? Do you have you made your plans on what to read this year, what to do this year? Because I've made my plans and then I've already run out of steam. Now I'm doing stuff, which is not the stuff that I plan to do. Although I'm already neck deep in Mormon studies, I'm doing too much of that. I just got myself both a copy of the Book of Mormon and, of course, the Doctrines and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, because I want to take this stuff seriously. 39,000 words, mate. That's pretty fucking good. That's almost a full national novel writing month. And you're still working on your Western Britain. That sounds interesting. You're like fully into the next hybrid helix now, Joe, or are you doing something else for now? And how's the Grim Dwarf keeping? I've avoided most of the internet and social media for the last couple of weeks. Been very inactive on both Discord and Twitter and all the other things because it's the beginning of the year, and I usually celebrate a new year by falling into a black hole where I do nothing except recover from reading too much Salvatore. Wow. Yes, you basically wrote 27th today. That's minus 11 days. That's 16 days. 16 days, 39. Wow. That is, well, more than 2,000 words per day. That's not too bad. That's me doing maths in my head. It's not very good. I'm sorry. Next hybrid helix. You already have a title for it. I know you've said so in a comment to my video for releases that come out in 2024, and then I already forgot because you don't have a publication date for it yet, or so I've heard. All right, so the Grimdorf is still going strong. If you haven't read the Grimdorf yet, Joe has this magazine that will feature way too many giraffe people, and it's a free magazine of necromantic dwarfs beating the living shit out of everyone and drinking too much. And other people can submit stories. So if you have a short story or something, send it to Joe and join the Grim Dwarf Revolution, which sounds really cool. Yeah, dude. Look, I'm gonna do that Sanderson thing right, and that means I need to understand some parts of Mormon history and Mormon theology, and in a way, because I can read Gene Wolfe, and when I do, you know, I can fill in the Catholic stuff because I didn't grow up very Catholic, but I definitely, I'm baptized and shit, so I can do these kind of things, but I don't know that much about Mormon beliefs in detail. And I do believe that even if, no one, not everyone sets out to write explicitly Mormon fiction. I don't think Sanderson does set out to write explicitly Mormon fiction. These underlying ideas of cosmology and theology, they sort of creep in. And for me, it's important to understand those aspects. So I'm doing my best to, figure them out, I guess. And that means doing the work. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm glad you're enjoying the King of Morning, Queen of Day. It's a I love that book. For some reason, no one knows about it. If you haven't read it yet, go read Ian MacDonald's King of Morning, Queen of Day, which is a novel about Ireland and fairies, possibly. Also, hunting fairies with cybered up samurai swords. Maybe. Eyes of Empire. See, that's an interesting thing. Like you say, like late spring, and from what I remember, your novels have something around 120,000 words. So that's a very, very quick turnover from finishing the first draft to getting it edited and stuff. I'm impressed. And you're probably right, Joe, that not that many people know that much about Mormonism, but look, I may not be BookTube's foremost expert on Arthurian literature, but I can try to become BookTube's foremost expert on Mormon influences in fantasy and science fiction. Interestingly enough, a shorter introduction that I read today on the Mormonism: What Everyone Needs to Know by Terrell L. Givens, who is a Mormon. He's an LDS scholar, but also an actual history professor and everything, published through Oxford University Press, does name drop not only Brandon Sanderson and Austin Scott Card, but also Larry Correa, which I guess will make people like Liam very happy that he gets actually mentioned from time to time. So yeah, um, we'll see how far I take all of this. But my plan is to read both the Book of Mormon and, of course, the Book of the Price of Great, the Pearl of Great Price, and the Doctrines and Covenants. And then I have a history of Mormonism, or the Mormon, a history of Mormonism, coming out on Tuesday. It's called American Zion, which I am very much looking forward to. It's a very new one. Well, it's a brand new one, so it has access to a lot of documents that were sort of made public and opened in the last couple of years. So that's going to be interesting. And maybe I'll also read Terrell Given's Wrestling with the Angel, which is a sort of larger analysis and explanation of Mormon cosmology and theology on a more analytical background. And my goal is, with all of that background knowledge, that when I go and start reading Elantris, which will be the first Sanderson novel, that I have sort of a framework that I can use there. There's another, nonfiction book on Mormonism and white supremacy, which goes back to that whole like Children of Ham kind of weird part, I assume, but we'll see how important that is. And I have another interesting academic text on the way the LDS Church has connected to and furthered and built influence in the US media industry in a lot of ways. And I think that also might be an interesting further context to talking about people like Brandon Sanderson and their success in a lot of ways. So that's sort of my reading plans right now. We'll see how long that will take. I assume way too long. Yeah, that's what I remember from my Mistborn reading, Pressifine. It's been like, I don't know, 15 years since I read Mistborn, probably. Like the Era 1 trilogy, and I didn't completely hate it. I certainly found stuff that I found problematic back then. I'm sure I'll find way more when I reread it now. Especially about, around the Scar. And of course the whole democracy really doesn't work, right? Plotline of volume 2, which I always forget which one is which. The first one is the Hero of Ages, right? Then it's Well of Ascension and something else. I don't know. Never mind. It's Mistborn. It's got way too many books. I know Eloy of Law is the first one of Era 2, and I kind of like that one, I think. Hey, Anna, how you doing? Great to see you here. I hope I'm not too late or too early for you, because I seem to remember you're in a wildly different time zone than me. Hey, Chris, I'll try to go gently on you with the Marxism. We'll see how it goes. But I'm glad you made it here, and sorry for being slow with reading the chat. It's a bit of a struggle today. So yeah, as Big as said, Jeroen, it's called King of Morning, Queen of Day. It's one of Ian MacDonald's early novels, and it's like a three-parter with three different generations of women in Ireland in like the 1913, the 1930s, and then the 1989. They're like three generations of the same family, and they all encounter supernatural events in and around Dublin and Sligo. Uh, and through that kind of lens, you also see Ireland as a country evolve and change over time. It's really fun, and way too few people talk about it beyond me. I actually talked about it, I think, in my first year on BookTube, which tells you all about my channel and how incredibly successful I am at this. Oh no, Jeroen, I'm sorry for that. I blame YouTube. Yes, Britton. I'm doing the Mormon deep dive as sort of a background, and then over the year, I'll read my personal selection of what I think is essential to understand the Cosmere, and that will be Elantris, Mistborn Era 1, Warbreaker, Mistborn Era 2, and Stormlight Archive, all the way up to Wind and Truth, which for some reason I always want to call Wind and Fury, which I still maintain is the far better title. um, so I can use, historical background and the theological background, all of that stuff to analyze Sanderson's Cosmere work. And at the same time, I'm still planning to do the other project, which is the Sanderson's personalized marketing culture industry project that I've been working on, or pushing ahead of myself for the last year. Now that may be overkill, but it's certainly my approach to talking about Sanderson, because I've always felt that, like, there's, on the one hand, there's a lot of people talking about Sanderson and loving Sanderson and thinking he's like the second coming of Tolkien, or whatever you want. Well, probably more like the second coming of Robert Jordan, or whatever you want to call it. But he praising him to high heavens. And then there's people who go like, well, his writing is boring. It's a small vocabulary, and it sucks. And then there's people who go like, we hate Sanderson because he's a Mormon, and Mormons don't like the gays, so he doesn't like the gays, so we don't like him. And I'm like, yeah, maybe. And there's certainly that older blog post of his that he has sort of gone back on and so forth. But I want to bring all of these things together, because I don't think you it's how to say that. I don't think it's a proper approach to just take one thing of Sanderson's. I think you need to actually take all these different things and engage critically with the writing of Sanderson, because he may be a dick, and I don't think so. Just to make that very clear, I think Brandon Sanderson, the human being, from what I have seen of him, is probably a very nice human being. So blaming the Mormon Church's positions on gay marriage on Sanderson and using that to criticize Sanderson, you need to do the work and actually look at the cosmology and theology, and not go, oh, I've heard this thing. And that's sort of like where I want to go, and what I want to do is like sort of connect these things to do the whole thing justice, and not just go for the cheap shots, which I may be very sorry to do in, like, I don't know, after like 2 chapters of Elantris. We will see. There's entirely the chance that I'll be incredibly wrecked by despair and regret in a similar way that I was with all the R.A. Salvatore stuff. That is obviously a possibility, but I'll try to be as objective as I can, just to I'd hate to be called I don't know, unjust, or in any way biased before I go there. So that's why I'm doing the whole like Mormon thing. Also, I'm learning a lot about the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, and American history right now. So that's neat. And I'm certainly not regretting that. Okay, we're having the usual problem, which is me pressing the more comments button and then everything freezing. So I don't know what you're saying, but I hope it's going to be really good. Yeah, and that's, for example, that's part of it. It's like I don't need bigamy jokes and stuff like that because I don't see that. That's sort of like that's going for the easy ones. Like I don't make like Pope jokes when I talk about Tolkien either, and he was a very devout Catholic. I think there's deeper underlying things, and I think from what I can tell, there's something very specifically American and very specifically 19th and 20th century American within the Mormon tradition, within the larger Latter Day Saints tradition that sort of makes that very specific form of religion very fascinating, but also like very seductive, very tempting, and very yeah, very seductive to a lot of people, and makes it also a good or like a very fertile ground for fantasy and science fiction, and brings with it certain aspects of a more optimistic kind of approach to the world that lends itself to the kind of fantasy that Sanderson is writing. And I think there's something in there, but I'd like to have a bit more actual, knowledge in doctrines and shit before I make grand claims on Mormon theology. I'm not a theologist at this point. Well, I'm glad you're appreciating my hard work here, Joe. Yeah, I respect his workload. I will not say too much on the Wheel of Time stuff, though, Chris. I think Wheel of Time sucks. I don't think so. Here's what I think: Brandon Sanderson was the perfect person to finish up Wheel of Time. He did a great job of finishing that book, that series of books. He couldn't save it though because it was already fundamentally flawed from the beginning onwards. So there's that. Um, there's, however, a few things that he brought where you can definitely see the shift from Jordan to Sanderson in the last three books that I think is interesting to just see how Sanderson's writing, the way Sanderson sets up adventure, like scenes, the way he sets up conflicts, and the way he sets up action scenes in particular that are very, very specifically Sanderson. When you can see that in Wheel of Time, I think. Hey, John, how you doing? You made it. Well, Sanderson may be fairly progressive compared to some people. I mean, I guess he's less of a Stone Age person than Orson Scott Card, which I think is good. But I don't know much more about it. So he's always been very careful to not state explicit political opinions, unlike, say, Larry Correia or Orson Scott Card, and I respect that. Well, up to a point. I'm still going to try to pin down as many political and theological and religious positions as possible in his writings, because I'm that kind of bastard. Well, Jeroen, I might have been 20 minutes late. I'm good at being late. Most people who know me can tell you that your your suspicion was, while false in this specific case, not unjustified. So yeah, I think, for example, when it comes to that Sanderson action scene kind of thing, Sanderson does write action scenes very much influenced by computer games, by video games, I think, in a way that previous writers, especially people like, say, Robert Jordan, don't do. By which I mean, it, Sanderson has discovered the third dimension. Like, there's a scene in one of the later Wheel of Time books. I don't know which one it is, and they're back in that oh, God, the the kingdom of the main town of Andor that they also end up in the first city. I've forgotten so many names. Anyway, point is they're back there and they have this combat, and suddenly people float upwards and do shit like that, and suddenly you have these ideas that, and people can not only fight from left to right and back to front, but they can also go up and down, and I think that's sort of what I mean by action scenes that feel inspired by video games, that you see a lot of that, and the whole combat in the second, like, I guess it's in Towers of Midnight, the whole scene where they have that long ass combat scene in and the Aes Sedai Tower, in the White Tower. They have that whole combat scene between like the dream world and the other world. And yeah, I'm totally spoiling Wheel of Time, but if you haven't read it yet, don't do it. Live with the consequences. But you have that whole thing with Perrin doing his dream world, hunting the guy, and at the same time Egwene is doing her fighting on the different layers of the tower, and it feels very much like a video game, the way it is all set up. And that's something I don't think Robert Jordan would ever have written that way. And it's something you see when you read Mistborn as well, right? The key thing about the Mistborn magic system is that you can push yourself from tower to tower, and you have these weird, like, so much about that is like about movement, about spatial movement, because that allows for interestingly choreographed fight scenes and action scenes, and that's what Sanderson brought to fantasy, or brings to fantasy, that makes it very accessible to an audience that grew up on playing video games, that can see their experience from other media like video games represented in fantasy, which makes fantasy more accessible. Because if all you've played is 3D shooters and stuff like that, a lot of the Rings action scenes, battle scenes, seem incredibly boring, because nothing much happens there. Not even dwarfs get thrown, which is good, and no one surfs on fucking elephants or anything of the sort. So there's something that Sanderson brought to that form of action scene that I think makes Sanderson so approachable to a younger audience that has maybe not read too many books before they come into Sanderson, especially hasn't read a lot of traditional and epic fantasy. And I think that may be part of what makes Sanderson so approachable and so happy, so successful, and makes people think that he's a good author. I assume that accidentally endorsing fascism thing is ironic. I've, as I said, only read the fourth one. I've only read Alloy of Law. I have not read, what's it, Band of Mourning or Shadows of Self, one of those. I don't know. I got confused when he had named the fourth one of the second of Era 2. He named it The Lost Metal, and I was always expecting some dissertation on 80s demo tapes or whatever, or a written out novelization of Militia's The Sibling EP or something like that, but apparently it was just another Mistborn book, which is a bit of a shame. Yeah, Britain. Islam, I think, is interesting, but look, this is not me doing the Religions of the World channel. I need some larger motivation, because I don't think there's there's channels out there that do history and religion and atheism and whatnot, and I'm not that kind of channel yet. So I don't think I'll just talk about Islam unless I have like a larger motivation to do so, because I don't think I'll be the right person to educate anyone on matters of faith. I've obviously not done videos on Catholicism either. Oh, although who knows? I mean, if I go and finally do the thing that I want to do about A Song for Arbonne by Guy Gavriel Kay, I might have to talk a bit about Catholic doctrine, and why, say, Cathar heresies are very much incompatible with it, because they verge into dualism, and dualism is very much fundamentally incompatible with Christianity in a way that, say, the Waldensian heresy, while still being considered a heresy, is not, because it does not actually attack fundamental ideas of the Trinity or Christology or anything of the sort. So anyway, I'm rambling into theology, and this is not what I should do on a Saturday evening. Hey, Jose. Yeah, well, but I mean, that's one of those things, the idea of redemption for every character with a dark past. That's, for example, one thing that you can tie back to Mormon theology, and the idea that in Mormon theology, as far as I can say for now, uh, hell and damnation is not something that most people get. There's a chance for different forms of redemption in that cosmology, which makes it a more optimistic cosmology and theology compared to your average standard Christian theology. So that might be one of the moments where you can see how Sanderson's belief or faith does in fact impact his writing. And we can argue about whether that is good or bad, but I think that that's sort of like the things that I want to look at. No, Jen, the act of questioning religion is not heresy. The idea of heresy is that, first of all, you can only be a heretic if you're part of a church. And if you then come up with alternative forms of belief, but still claim to be part of the same form of religion, that's where heresy happens. It's well, believing the wrong thing. So as a Catholic, trying to come up with heterodox ideas about Catholic theology can land you in in heresy. Say Martin Luther, at the time he was nailing his theses against putting out flyers and stuff, so to speak, whether he actually did that or not, he was not claiming to leave the Catholic Church. He was arguing about different interpretations of faith with the Pope, which is why the Pope could declare him a heretic, because he's still considered part of the Catholic Church at the time. But someone who was never baptized could not be a heretic, and they could question the Catholic faith as much as they want. They'll just be a pagan, which, there's a difference there. Well, Chris, I can't recommend anything by Sanderson because I've only read Mistborn Era 1 and the first Mistborn Era 2 book yet. I've heard good things about Warbreaker, but then again, this being Sanderson, I don't think there's any Sanderson work that is ever finished, because he's always going to write. There's going to be more Elantris books, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be like another Warbreaker book at some point in the future as well. So I don't know. Maybe people in the chat can actually jump in if you've read Sanderson. But as I said, I've heard good things about Warbreaker, and it's a standalone so far. Should we tell political parties that other options than left and right exist? I don't know if so. Obviously, I guess it really depends on where you are. Maybe we should tell American political parties that another direction than right does exist, because I don't think you guys have figured out what left actually means at this point. Uh, but yeah, I think there's the problem is with a lot of, like, the way I look at current political systems in what you might call the West is that for historical reasons, a lot of our political framework that we're currently in has moved fairly far to the right. There's some aspects that have moved forward in, that are fairly progressive, which is just a result of, societies with relative economic affluence will become more progressive when it comes to social aspects. And yes, there's a lot of anti-trans sentiments at the moment, and so forth, a lot of transphobia going on, but these, I think, are still a sign of social progress, in that, compared to, say, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, uh, trans issues have become part of like an actual, have become part of discourse. People are at least, acknowledging that trans people exist, to the point that, the Nazis decide that they're worth fighting against. So there is that aspect. But when it comes to economic policies, when it comes to larger social policies, stuff like that, society has moved so far into a neoliberal sort of hellhole that it's very difficult to even talk about, policies that are that I would consider fairly middle of the road and center, social democrat, if you will. Those are already considered, radical leftists, which they're not. And I think that's sort of where we're stuck at the moment. That and that policies that are absolutely necessary, especially when it comes, to environmental issues and stuff like that, right? We've moved to a point where it's so difficult to even talk about that stuff, because an older generation, the generations that are currently, running politics in a lot of ways, and running the administrations and so forth, are unwilling to change anything, whereas the younger generation, Gen Z and so forth, right, are seeing everything going to hell, and anything they're trying to do on a democratic level, right, going to vote, and going to maybe even democratically protest and so forth, does not have any impact on it. And then the question is, like, where does that lead? And, one option is, of course, the Andreas Malm school of how to blow up a pipeline, because radicalism happens when people realize that the system that we're sort of that the official ways of changing, or working towards change, don't actually work, because you're sort of soft excluded, not officially excluded, but you're kind of ignored in that system. And that's kind of where radicalism happens. And I think that's why I'm not sure if telling political parties that there's more than left and right will actually do anything, because political parties are so entrenched oftentimes in the system that they are unable or unwilling to even do the things within the framework of left and right that they could do at this point. I hope that makes sense. I don't know. Not that this was Marxist, but I hope I'm not overwhelming you, Chris. The goal was not to turn this into me starting a party, a political party, and laying out my further political program. I've heard very good things about Emperor's Soul, Price of Iron. It's like, I haven't read it, but people that I trust and people that are very critical of Sanderson at large have always mentioned Emperor's Soul as like the best piece of writing that he has done. Once again, this is secondhand. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard very good things about it. Yeah, you're right, Jeroen. There's always been part of the tradition is, and you need that part of a tradition that allows to question, especially in the mystical traditions. I mean, and those are often very close to heresy. And if you have a structure like in the Catholic Church, for example, and as it turns out in the Mormon Church, with the prophet there and the Pope in the Catholic Church, there is an arbiter that can tell you whether your questioning has crossed the line towards heresy, which is, for example, why you have both Peter Baldo, the guy who runs the Waldensians, and later Francis of Assisi, both write to the Pope and go like, "Hey, I have these issues, and I've started this kind of order." I don't want to call it cult here, but like, is that cool with you or not? And then the Pope goes, "No, Waldensians are heretics." And the next Pope goes like, "Well, yeah, Francis, I guess Franciscans are cool, so go ahead, be poor." So I think that's an important aspect there. John, fucking Slanesh hentai. God. You guys are writing too much, or I'm talking too much and not reading comments because always I have to go back and scroll down further. Oh, by the way, I guess I have to ask that. Like, is the audio quality good this time compared to the last times when we had the audio issues? That's just something I was it worth me buying a new cable for my microphone? Is I guess the question that I'm secretly asking. Look, Britain, there is anti-Semitism in Christianity. There has always been there. Depending on at what point and in which part of Christianity you're hanging out, it has taken different forms. It starts out with, the separation between Second Temple Judaism, or like the part of Second Temple Judaism that turns into Christianity, the questions, and you start out like in that time you have an overlap between people following the teachings of Christ on the one of Jesus on the one hand, but also still going to synagogue and stuff like that. And over time, you start both sides coming up with more strict interpretations to build that separation, and that's sort of where a lot of that anti-Semitism kind of starts. And it then also takes on older forms of anti-Judaist elements. I mean, at this point, you can only call it anti-Judaism. It's not fully, anti-Semitism as per term, because anti-Semitism as a term is defined and starts around the mid 19th century by a couple of German nationalists who start the anti-Semitic party, and use that term to give it a more sort of scientific framing. But obviously, you have had anti-Judaism, and both a religious anti-Judaism and a ethnic anti-Judaism, a racist anti-Judaism before then, all the way back to Hellenistic Greece, where you can already find parts of that. And, with Hellenism having such a huge impact on early Christianity, no wonder that those bits and pieces ended up in Christian anti-Semitism as well. Yeah, I know you're a man of your word, John. I was just curious because I messaged you earlier and then I didn't see you online. I'm like, oh, maybe he's busy doing stuff. Yo, AST, ASDQ, and so forth. I hope you're doing good. I hope you're having a good time so far. So I guess that's my thoughts on anti-Semitism in Christianity. It's been there forever. It's built in for historical reasons, and depending on where you are, it has taken different forms. Like Catholic anti-Semitism is very different from, say, Lutheran anti-Semitism, and Martin Luther has beyond a lot of other things. Martin Luther, let's establish that Martin Luther was a massive dick and a massive anti-Semite and a massive sexist and a racist and so many other things. Let's just establish that. But it's a different form of anti-Semitism than, say, Catholic anti-Semitism, I guess. I have not yet read Jeff Noon, Britain, but he's got a new book coming out next month in like 2 weeks. I think on the 15th. No, the 13th, I think, of February, together with Steve Beard, which, if your name is Beard, you already have my attention. It's called Gog Magog, and I'm definitely going to read it as soon as it comes out. That's all I can say about Jeff Noon. I'm aware of Jeff Noon. I've just, never read any of his stuff, which is definitely one of my many failings. So yeah, the China Mieville thing is interesting. I haven't read the comics either, obviously. I'll read it when it comes out. Because I think it's interesting to see what China Mieville comes up with no matter what. It's interesting for me that someone like Mieville, after writing basically nonfiction with his text on the Communist Manifesto and his text on the October Revolution, returns to fantasy and to fiction, so to speak, with a sort of tie-in novel to a product. So that's weird. But I've got the Book of Elsewhere on my list of stuff that I'll read as soon as it comes out, and then I'll know more. I mean, on the other hand, good for Keanu Reeves that he goes like, "Hey, China Mieville is the guy to write my book." That's somewhat unexpected, but cool. And yeah, I don't know. As I said, like, I haven't read the graphic novels. I have no idea how bad or good they are. So there's that. But I'm pretty sure that at the end of the day, it's more like Mieville coming up, doing the actual writing, and Reeves coming up with the storyline or something. I don't know if anyone has actually read the graphic novel. Then maybe they know more about it. I just feel like Keanu Reeves seems to be a real nerd in a lot of ways, and I appreciate that for someone of his, um, sort of public standing or whatever you want to call it, to go like, yeah, hell, I want to write fantasy now. I do appreciate that. It's cool. See, here's the thing, Jen. I haven't watched Dragon Ball Z, so I have no idea how good that is. I've met really cool religious people. I've met really terrible religious people. I think it's as oftentimes uh, it's it's sort of the framework, right? For me, I think religion is one way to give you a moral framework that you can work with, and the basics of, say, the Ten Commandments. They're not that bad, really. Like, I mean, most of those are pretty good, especially the social part about not killing, not stealing, not taking stuff, not cheating on your spouse if you're in like a committed relationship. All that stuff's pretty solid advice, I would say. Um, and for a lot of people, religion kind of gives you that kind of framework. The question is like how you deal with that and what you do around that and how you apply it to all kinds of other questions. And you can do that terribly wrong, and you can have a more distance approach where you take the things that speak to you and deal with that. Um, like uh, like years and years ago, when I was still in high school, basically, we went to a monastery, um, to a Catholic monastery, a Benedictine monastery. Interestingly enough, with our music course, like music and history class, because they were like a Benedictine monastery that did very much practice Gregorian chanting, Gregorian choir chanting as part of their very specific religious observance. And we went there and was interesting. We'll listen to the monks doing their singing, really impressive shit. Like if you've ever sat in like an old Gothic cathedral style church and have a choir of monks doing Gregorian chanting, that shit's impressive. But we also, as part of that, like had like a couple of conversations with like monks from there. And one of the guys, like not the abbot, but like second or like one of the higher ups, and he was a really cool dude. And we talked to him. And was like, yeah, well, of course we're all we're all gay here to some level, because we're a bunch of dudes who have been locked into one very specific place, and humans will develop attraction. It's just what happens. Of course, we're all gay. Now, we don't have orgies all the time, but the attraction is there, and it would be wrong to deny that exists and go with that. And I'm like, yeah, that's really cool. So, I'm like, yeah, that's the kind of religious person I can deal with. It's like, yeah, that's you can do with that whatever you want, because you found a way to be accepting within the framework of your belief. Now, do I think it's a good idea to have a bunch of people, basically lock themselves into a place and then deny all their instincts and their sexuality and so forth? I was like, no, probably not. But if you do that consensually and you agree to that as an adult, and I won't stop you. Britain, I have no idea how to talk to China Mieville. I have no contacts whatsoever. I think the way to figure that stuff out is to find out who his agent is, who his publicist is, and contact them and ask if China Mieville is interested in having a conversation. And I would only do that after I've read the Book of Elsewhere. I will not ask for anything before that, because I don't want to go like, hey, want to have a conversation? Also, your new book sucks. I don't think that's a good basis to start a conversation. Karl Marx and anti-Semitism is a very complicated thing. Yes, Marx wrote a text on it's called something on the international Jewry or something like that. It's an early text. And it's certainly, yeah, there's some highly problematic anti-Semitic stuff in there, but it's sort of he's falling down that very specific slippery slope of capitalism and that turns into, or criticizing capitalism that can turn into anti-Semitism in a way that, large capital was often connected to different groups of Jews in the early 19th century. There's a very nuanced analysis to be done about that text, but yes, Marx did very much criticize Jews in a way that is definitely anti-Semitic. I think that's the way to go about that. He's not like a massive anti-Semite in any way, but that one specific essay or text or whatever you want to call it does go into very specific anti-Semitic forms, nevertheless. Now, I have not read Miebel's October, but I don't think he tries to do scholarly things. I think his introduction to the Communist Manifesto is a very good introduction. October, I think it's more about trying to explain, or not explain, but build understanding for how and why, how the October Revolution, like the revolution in Russia, happened at the time, to give people an understanding, because depending on where you are in Western education, you may not understand why on why there was a socialist or Soviet revolution in Russia in the early 20th century, because if all you've learned about the end of the Tsar's family comes from a Disney movie, you may need some form of correction. And in that case, I think October does a very good job of explaining the dynamics of what happened at the time. Probably better than a more scholarly work, I think. I think that's how I would sort of defend October if I had to defend it. But yeah, I mean, scholarly standards. I mean, which fiction writer or even like popular nonfiction writer does in fact live up to scholarly standards? Hey Ori, how you doing? I mean, I saw like a China Mieville conversation on Novara Media when he put out his book on the Communist Manifesto like 2 years ago. But then again, Novara Media is obviously a very specific leftist kind of media outlet. So now I have no idea if he's even interested in talking to just booktubers. So who knows? Yeah, well, none of the people running the revolution in 1917 were the kind of people you want to have in charge afterwards. Like, obviously, it would not have degenerated into Stalinism if Trotsky had been in charge, because then it would have degenerated into a very specific form of Trotskyism. But yeah. I have read Jeff Vandermeer. I don't think he's the best sci-fi author living at the moment, but he's certainly a very unique and interesting author. And I do very much enjoy what Vandermeer is doing whenever he's doing something. He's got a new one coming out this year, later this year, maybe, or maybe next year. He's certainly writing a fourth Southern Reach novel, so that's something I'll be looking forward to. If he can actually finish it and is not too busy posting, I don't know, raccoon pictures and stuff. But you know who has a new book coming out? I've said that earlier on the Unabridged Bonus Discord channel. There's a new Hannu Rajaniemi book coming out, and you may not know Hannu Rajaniemi, because who does? But he wrote The Quantum Thief, and that was a really cool book, I don't know, 15 years ago? And then he wrote a weird book about British Secret Service talking to ghosts called Summerland. I mean, the Quantum Thief was an entire trilogy. It was gods. Jean Le Flambeur was the main character, and I keep forgetting what the other two were called. Fractal Prince was one, and the third one I have no idea, because my memory is bad. And but yeah, so I'm very much looking forward to that. It's called Darkholme, and it's apparently about bio and gene tech and terrorism. It's certainly going to be an interesting book, and it's coming out in September. So that's one I'm very much looking forward to. I don't think there's such a thing as greatest living writer, because we need to define writer, and then we need to get them all into like a room and need to figure out who's the tallest of them. And I don't think that works. Best living sci-fi author. I don't know. I wouldn't know, because I don't think it's easy to find, to make that kind of statement. There are some that I think are interesting, that have stuff that do things with with the way they're writing, that I find interesting for sci-fi as a genre. Say, at the end of the day, I think the stuff that people like N.K. Jemisin or Lavi Tidar or Catherine Valente or Cameron Hurley are doing with the sci-fi genre are far more interesting to me personally than whatever it is that James S.A. Corey are doing. Nevertheless, a lot of people really enjoyed The Expanse, because it works really well as a written story or a series. But which one is the better sci-fi author? I think maybe Ian MacDonald has a claim to that whole being one of the. He certainly a claim on being one of the most underrated trad published sci-fi authors of the century. But it's I don't know. I don't think it's a worthwhile question, like who's the best or whatever. A lot of these bring interesting facets to the genre and do move me as a reader, and move me as a, hopefully move more than just me as a reader. So there's that. I think that's a more meaningful approach to asking that question than going like, who's the best? Because like, who fucking cares? Jin, I don't think it's necessary to write in first person, because even if you write in first person, you get into all kinds of trouble, because you can write in first person and not put yourself in there unless you're writing, diaries or blog posts or whatever. I think we as as a society need to figure out how we do that kind of stuff, how much of an author's opinion we read into something. And we've been trying to do that forever. And then, Roland Barthes came along, goes like, hey, no, you should totally think of the author as dead. But it's very difficult to do that. And we're obviously not having a Roland Barthes discussion today. I don't have the nerves for that. My point is, say, take a text like A Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe, which is a first-person narrative. Is Severian Gene Wolfe? Of course not. And yet there's a lot of people who have trouble with reading, or not trouble with reading. I think it's more like that don't enjoy reading Book of the New Sun because some of the things that Severian believes or claims he believes, and some of the things the narrator says he does and so forth, are really fucked up. And it's very difficult to then go like, well, maybe we're not to identify with that first person narrator, because maybe that's there to make another statement. And I think at that point, if you're writing fiction, you're always building some sort of filter between the author and the reader, and that's always going to be there. And there's no way to get around that. But depending on who we are as readers, we get more or less good at actually being aware of that filter, and we tend to ignore it from time to time. And certainly when you look at a lot of like current book content on BookTube or Book Talk or whatever, very specific literal interpretations are certainly very popular at the moment, which means like if something bad is described in a book, that obviously means the author endorses that very specific bad thing, which is, not how that works. And I feel that having a first-person narrator would only make that form of literal misreading, I guess, even more prevalent, which I don't know if that's a good thing, because it certainly doesn't help with literary discourse, I guess. Doesn't like everything ever in the US happen because of tax disputes? I think Iron Council, I mean, that's an interesting question. Like, Iron Council is interesting in that it does have very specific things to say about, attempts at organizing, attempts at unionizing, and how they sometimes fail, and how sometimes all you can do is fail gloriously. So the next generation has at least the option of open, right? One of the things, if you go and read like Mark Fisher, like Capital is Realism, one of the things that we suffer with is how our thinking and how our fiction have closed off a lot of imaginary avenues, or avenues of imagination. I think that's a better term, right? Avenues of imagination, how they have closed that off, and how we can't even think these things, much less actually go and act on them. And sometimes even failure keeps that avenue of imagination, that avenue of potential political action open, because we know it has been done before. It's why, say, a book like The Dawn of Everything by Fraser by Graeber and Vengro is such an important text, because it does try to reopen these avenues of imagination, of understanding, going like, well, look, humans have made societies that were not cutthroat capitalist to the max. We've had other options. We've done that before, and they were successful. So the narrative that there are no alternatives is, I think, the troubling thing. And I think Iron Council is sort of going down that direction, like justifying the approach, even if it fails, and sometimes failing is like the only thing you can do, but at least you fail. There's a level of fatalism in there as well with Iron Council, isn't there? compared that does tie well into, say, modern like climate change protests and stuff like that. That idea that you got to do something even if it fails. And that's my very and it's been ages since I last read Iron Council, so that's me from memory coming up with stuff. So don't blame me if I'm wrong. My memory's bad. Yeah, trouble with Gene Wolfe is sort of, I guess, built in, which might be an interesting approach to go and do some like hardcore Catholicism rereading and research again, and refreshing my memories on Catholicism and Catholic doctrine, to go and apply that to reading, say, The Wizard and the Knight, and rereading the Book of the New Sun and the Book of the Long Sun and the Book of the Short Sun and general Catholic fiction, because Gene Wolfe and Tolkien are obviously Catholic, for example, and we know that Tolkien has had a huge impact on Gene Wolfe, and Gene Wolfe really loved Tolkien, and even wrote him a letter and got a letter back from Tolkien, which I still think is just like really, really nice. I did really appreciate The Land Across for its weirdness, Britain. I don't think it's not the kind of Gene Wolfe novel I would recommend people start with. But if you've ever been to Eastern Europe or former socialist or former Eastern Bloc parts of Europe, a lot of the way how he describes the land across does feel I don't know. I don't want to say authentic because it's obviously not authentic, but it does feel reasonable. I don't know. It feels like something that could potentially be real, in a way that, say, the City and the City and the City by China Mieville always also does feel weirdly Balkan in a way, I think. If that makes sense. I don't know if how many of you have ever been to, say, Zagreb or Belgrade or places like that. The Wizard Knight, I think, might be an easier one than Book of the New Sun. It's sort of Norse mythology mixed with Arthurian bits and stuff. It also has a very cool talking dog and a very cool talking cat who do not like each other. Book of the New Sun is, of course, sort of like the Gene Wolfe thing book that everyone will recommend. I think they're all worthwhile reading. I think Book of the New Sun is suffering from the same kind of thing that Malazan is kind of suffering from, which is like, there are people out there who have hyped up Book of the New Sun as the ultimate complex book or big brain book that leads to a form of gatekeeping, whether it's intended or not. And I think that's harming. That can be harmful for people to approach reading Book of the New Sun. Like, I read Book of the New Sun before I ever was on BookTube or anything of the sorts. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to understand it. And I think that's a healthy approach to it, because you can read it just as an adventure story, and it's fine as that. And then you can go back and read it and go like, oh, he's doing this tricky thing, and here's that reference and that reference, and those are cool. And then you go and read it again and go like, oh, and he's dealing with these really weird themes about rebirth and Christian theology, and especially Catholic looks on Christian theology. You can do all of these things, but you don't have to. You can just read it about a shirtless incel with a huge sword walking across Latin America, mostly, I guess, Argentina, and killing people. And I think that's a valid approach to reading that book. Yeah, that's the other part, in that, like, Gene Wolfe, being the Gene Wolfe that he is, goes like, here's everything that will happen in the next 4 books in the first chapter. And then at the end of the book, he goes like, well, and if you didn't get it, maybe just read it again. And there's very few authors who can pull that off without coming across as pretentious or anything. And Gene Wolfe is one of the very few who can do that, because yes, rereading Book of the New Sun does give you a very different insight into the book that reading it the first time just can't do. But yeah, if you don't approach it with like too much respect, you can figure it out very fairly easily and just have a good time with it. But the way we do book discourse nowadays, which is like, when you talk about, say, Roland Barthes with like his form of like death of the authors, like you need to divorce that. We also sort of need a death of the reader at this point, where we like, if we watch BookTube and Book Talk or hang out on Goodreads or whatever, like how many of us do actually approach a new book that we pick up somewhere with like no preconceptions or no expectations beyond the ones that are sort of on the back cover or whatever? And even those can obviously be problematic. Like, how often does that happen, that you pick up a book and you have no idea what it's about? And it's important to understand that we kind of have taken that away up to a point. And I think especially stuff like Book of the New Sun, the Malazan Book of the Fallen is another one of those. There's a bunch of these things out there. Probably R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse is another one, where there is this image, this public image, and people that find out about these books online, of course, because who goes to a physical bookstore and just picks up something because the cover looks cool? People have a preformed expectation when they pick up these books. And that's very much, that does frame and impact our readings, whether we want to or not. And I think these sort of highbrow fantasy, if you want to call it that way, the stuff that people think is or complex or complicated, they do suffer from that at least as much as the stuff that is constantly called trash, like, I don't know, Fourth Wing or R.A. Salvatore. Well, Britain, have fun playing D&D. May you have a lot of crits. And that's right. Like, I think with Book of the New Sun, that's like Gene Wolfe tells you, like Severian tells you what's going to happen in the first chapter. It's like, yeah, I'm here waiting to become that stuff in the Autarch's palace. He says that in the first chapter, and then you go and read it, and you're still surprised about like how he ends up where he ends up, in a way that I think, say for example, Quoth in the Kingkiller Chronicles does sort of do the same thing, but far more on the nose, right? You start with the scene in the pub in Name of the Wind, and you have Quoth sitting there, and then the other guy's like, "Oh, are you that Quoth who did this and this and this and this and this?" And it's like, "Nah, I'm not going to talk about it." And then he does talk about it, and you can tell it's like 20 years since I read that fucking book. Not 20 years, but you know what I mean. My point is that it gives too many details, so it's not that much. But the tension in the story is still, similarly to Book of the New Sun, is more like, how does our narrator end up where he ends up, and less trying to figure out where they'll end up in a lot of ways. And I think that's a worthwhile form of a narrative, that form of narrative. It's sort of like the framing that Tolkien gives Lord of the Rings, in a way. When you read Lord of the Rings, when you read and start with the introduction about hobbits and stuff, and it was like, yeah, and all of that stuff was written down and kept by Meriadoc Brandybuck in the Red Book of the West March, and you have all of that stuff like laid out in the introduction, basically. So you know how it ends. You just need to figure out how they get there. And I think we've maybe, with our focus on plot and on spoilers and so forth, we've turned every plot into a form of like a whodunit, in the way of like, you don't want to know what happens in the next scene because you want to be surprised by the next scene. And somehow we've forgotten that that is still possible, even though we know where the end is. And I don't know when that happened and how that happened, but it's certainly something that I've seen. I think it makes reading stuff like Book of the New Sun a bit more difficult, maybe, or at least unusual. I think unusual is a better term here, if that makes any sense. No, I don't have an opinion on Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. I'm sorry, I have not read that. See, and I did not imagine the Alzabo to be a bear, but there you go. That being said, I think the Alzabo part is one of the creepiest bits in the entire story, and the idea of the Alzabo as a monster, I think, is such a classic horror monster that is highly underused, I think. Well, here's the thing about Chris. Here's the thing about the Stephen R. Donaldson, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. Yes, everyone has heard about the rape scene. It is highly disturbing, but it is also very much different from what people expect. Also, yes, of course, Thomas Covenant has leprosy. I think it's a worthwhile trilogy. It took me a while to understand or at least appreciate what Donaldson is doing. It has a very pathos-laden prose that can get on your nerves. You also have a main character that is incredibly whiny and self-pitying all the time. And that can be disturbing and that can be incredibly annoying and frustrating. I think if you read it as a larger meditation on the problems of having a disability or chronic illness of any form and being socially ostracized for that and trying to come to terms with that ostracization or the lack thereof, because if you've been ostracized long enough or if you've been marginalized long enough, you lose the ability to trust or accept the idea of social interactions or social bonds and relationships, and the difficulty that comes with that when you get the chance or maybe get the chance to trust again. That's sort of like the themes that come through that book, but it makes it a very painful story, despite it, also being a fantasy story about running around and fighting monsters and shit. But I think that's sort of what makes the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant such a hard read for a lot of people. They're sort of bland in some areas where everything becomes highly symbolic and stylized on the one hand, but then at the same time they're also incredibly painful because you have a lot of characters that never do anything and are just feeling bad and are sort of paralyzed by their inability to take agency now that they have it back, sort of. Which, made it very painful for me to read because as someone with a chronic illness, I do find a lot of myself in the way Thomas Covenant interacts, even though I don't have leprosy, of course. So it's a hard read, but it's a necessary read, I think, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'm still wondering whether I should talk about the new Alistair Reynolds novel. Like, I read it, Machine Vendetta, just to change the topic until I find new comments down there. I am very sorry, but I can't understand that joke. Biggest. I assume it's a joke, but I might be too slow, too German, or too used to having a screen reader. It does not necessarily translate every joke perfectly. Anyway, until I figure that one out, yeah, I read the new Alistair Reynolds, and I do like it. I'm just not sure if I want to make a video on. I talked about that, right? It's like I don't feel the motivation to make like videos that are all about spoiler-free reviews or anything of the sort, right? And I think Alistair Reynolds is maybe with this one sort of a bit of a problem there, because to explain why I love this book would mean me going through all the Revelation space stuff, and I don't want to do that, because sometimes they're just like really entertaining books, and they have their themes and stuff. But I don't think I can make like an entirely interesting video about each and every of these books. Yes and no. um, um, so, Chris, if you're talking about Alistair Reynolds, then yes, I reread both The Prefect and Elysium Fire, and that did definitely help, because Machine Vendetta is very much closing off and tying off the threads that are opened in both The Prefect and Elysium Fire. And I don't know if Reynolds plans to write a fourth Tom Dreyfus novel, because the way the third one ends feels very much like a sort of ending to that specific story. It wraps up a lot of stuff, so it was very satisfying to read. Don't get me wrong. It just didn't feel like talking much about it, I think. Which is an interesting question. It's like, is it still a good book if I don't have much to say beyond like, hey, I had fun reading this? And that's once again one of those issues that, right, like doing booktube, doing book talk, writing stuff on Goodreads or whatever, suddenly it's like the quality of a book is suddenly measured by our ability to create texts about the text. But is that actually what makes a book good? Our ability to talk about it, or shouldn't it be our ability to just enjoy it? And you know, I certainly did think about stuff while reading it, but it just doesn't add up to like a grand narrative. And that's sort of the problem, because if we do book talk on booktube or whatever, we're creating narratives whenever we do like videos, spoiler-free reviews, discussions or whatever. We kind of have some narrative arcs and shit like that in there. So is sort of we start valuing books or judging books by our ability to riff off them, and that changes like the way we talk about literature. That changes the way we appreciate literature, we read literature, and potentially the way we write literature in the future. And I think, yeah, I don't know where to go with this. I just find it interesting. I just don't have a clear idea of where to go with this. As for, yes, biggest, I think the Chronicles of Sandan Glocta, so to speak, like the first law, is more entertaining, and it does do some aspects of the experience of disability better, or at least more entertaining. Makes them more entertaining, and thus possibly more accessible. I would, however, say when it comes to the internal aspect of living with a chronic illness, of living with a disability, of having a lot of internalized ableism and stuff like that, in that regard, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant feel more real to me, feel more authentic to me. But that may exactly be the reason why they suck so much as an entertainment, why they are so hard to read, because It's just not as much fun as being a merciless torturer that sometimes shits himself. You know what I mean? And I think that's sort of the big problem that we always have when it comes to communicating certain forms of marginalization, especially when it comes to, communicating the experience of being marginalized, no matter in which regard. It's like there is that tension between verisimilitude or relatability or whatever you want to call it, like realism, authenticity, or whatever on the one hand, and accessibility and entertainment on the other hand, because we need to straddle that in some form or other, and it's very difficult to do that. And I think that Joe Abercrombie errs on the side of accessibility, or on the side of entertainment in this case. Accessibility is maybe a bit of a problematic term here because it could mean different things, which makes it, more readable and more entertaining, and possibly leads to more people thinking about it. On the other hand, Donaldson nails it very much, but that requires a lot of willingness of the reader to go there and suffer through all the more well, hard to read is probably the wrong term, but like this harshness that is built into the Donaldson books. And the question is like, what's better? And the answer is, I don't know. Hope that makes sense. So at the end of the day, I think both are worthwhile. If you want to have fun and enjoy it, then reading the first law will definitely be better. It may even, give you the impression that people with physical disabilities are very much able to still have agency and be people, need to be reckoned with, I guess. And that's an important lesson to learn. But if you want to have a clearer image of what it feels like to live with a chronic illness and have that constant doubt whether the rest of the world is actually taking you seriously, whether the rest of the world is constantly pushing you away, infantilizing you, or seeing you as helpless, without agency, or whatever, that constant mental battle that comes with chronic illness, or visible chronic illness, I guess. Yeah, that's something you find in Donaldson. And it's not fun. And I think that's that's the core problem. Is it's not fun. It has never been fun. Well, if you want fun and dark grim, may I recommend you go and read Richard K. Morgan's A Land Fit for Heroes, starting with The Steel Remains. That is slightly grim, and it's slightly dark, and incredibly violent. But it's also much more fast-paced than it's even faster paced than the Joe Abercrombie stuff. So be aware of that. But I think that's sort of the problem. Is like there's a bleakness in Thomas Covenant that, despite its like cynicism, the first law cannot match. And that's, yeah, as I said, it's kind of hard to describe that. But if you go into that with like the right idea, then I think you can have, well, not fun, but I think you can take a lot out of the Donaldson novels, the Thomas Covenant novels. They are, I mean, they're powerful, and they have like the status they have within the fantasy genre for a reason. Though it's a well-earned status, I think. About what? About the Steel Remains? I don't know. I thought I did something on the Steel Remains. I had a video conversation with John and Jen on the Steel Remains, I think. But that was like years ago. 2 years ago, I think. Oh yeah, right. That's the promise. Like, I think we even recorded a video on the cold commands, the Dark Defiles, and I never edited it because there's some editing to do in there, and then I kind of got sidetracked and stuff. And maybe I'll figure that one out at some point. I'm pretty sure I have the files somewhere, so I just need to do video editing, something I'm famously good at, and then we can upload that conversation. Because I think we have the one on cold commands as well. We just don't have the one on the Dark Defiles. I'm just sometimes really bad at that. It's like we recorded it and there were some technical issues, so I need to cut out some bits. And that takes time and me actually sitting down and committing to something. And as we all know, I'm really good at committing to stuff. I have not read The Gap Cycle. I've heard interesting things about it. But I haven't read it yet. Interestingly enough, there's a part of the Gap Cycle by Stephen R. Donaldson that is part of the whole like controversy that gave us Grimdark back in the day. So 2013, 14-ish, I think. Joe Abercrombie wrote a blog post called "The Value of Grid." I think it's called "The Value of Grid," something like that, and "The Virtue of Grid." Either one, and he talks about why he writes the way he writes and why some people get upset about it and get grimdark about it. And he links like 2 blog posts where people condemn his stuff and other stuff. And one of those 2 blog posts or articles by critics, other writers, and so forth, go into a lot of detail about one specific part of Donaldson's Gap Cycle and claim it's just, brutality and meaningless violence and stuff like that, and disparage it. And so that's what I have to think of when I hear about the Gap Cycle. I'm like, oh, it's the thing that gave us Grimdark, sort of. I have started the King James fanfic already. I'm somewhere in Nephi. I'm still in the first book of Nephi. I will move further on, though, Daniel, and welcome as well. And it's interesting that, for someone pretending, and Nephi is, of course, for someone pretending to be part of the tribe of Joseph and the heir of Joseph, he used the term the Jews a lot, which I find just interesting in a language way of things. So yeah, I am Mormoning it out, and it's interesting. It's fun. It's certainly, and I think that's fanfic does actually capture a lot of what the Book of Mormon provides, because it's, if you assume for a moment in a cynical way that the Old Testament is fiction, which I think is the wrong way of reading parts of it, at least. But if you assume that for a moment, then definitely the Book of Mormon is fanfic, in that it does focus heavily on the things that readers or fans of stuff focus on, which means the action. Which means there's always fucking angels around. Angels are basically more active up to now and Nephi are more active than anyone else. Like there's action all the time. Angels show up, and angels prevent this guy from doing this and this guy from doing that, and the Lord spake of all the time to Nephi and his father Lehi, or whatever his father's name is, and then Nephi goes to Jerusalem to get the bronze tablets with the family lineage and stuff like that. So what they do is they get into trouble, and then obviously the guy who has them and doesn't give them out, Nephi encounters him drunk in the street, so he just like takes his sword and chops the guy's head off and puts his cloak on and disguises himself as the owner and walks in and gets the tablets, and also convinces his servant to join the Lehites and Nephites and whatever you want to call them. And it's action packed. It doesn't make any sense, and also the Jews. Yeah, that's something that I was really interested in, about that whole like King James thing that you're saying there, Daniel, because I don't speak Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew, and my Greek is pretty fucked up as well. Like I don't. Is my point. Like how much of what we see in the King James Bible is in fact just like late 16th, early 17th century English, and how much of those yays and whatnot is actually already in the Septuagint text. That's something I don't necessarily know, because yes, Joseph Smith is definitely writing King James English, which is interesting. Because he's also very much writing something that is not necessarily doesn't necessarily work well with King James English, I guess. And as I said, like the whole part that like he's leaving Jerusalem because the Jews are evil, and I'm like, you just said you're part of that, right? I don't want to ridicule it too much right now, because I think it's an interesting text in a lot of ways. It does say a lot about early 19th century, 1920s, 1930s, no, 1820s, 1830s is what I'm saying here, right? Upstate New York, burnt over district, is one of the weirdest places in American history. With all the spiritists coming from there and all the different revivalist movements and stuff like that. And Mormonism does kind of play into that, and then goes its very weird own way. Well, Chris, thank you for showing up, and good night. So yeah, I'm definitely having fun with that book, with the Book of Mormon. I have now added both. I said that earlier, but when you weren't here, Daniel, I've also added the Doctrines and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price to my Sanderson warm up, and I'm really looking forward to that history of the Latter Day Saints Church, or Mormonism in general, American Zion, that is coming out on Tuesday. I should probably look up the name of the author so I can tell you what it is, because I think it's, from what I can tell, it's going to be as academic as you can get with that kind of history. So maybe I'll try to look it up and hope that this does not crash the actual stream. Give me a second here, because actually I found out about it because I'm following this anti-fascist historian who looks mostly at like right-wing politics in 20th century Oregon mostly. I'm following his like Substack newsletter, and he talked about that book, and because he's doing like an introduction for like authors readings and stuff like that, because he's like a fellow history professor, wrote the American Zion book, and I'm like, oh, that sounds right up my alley. Now that I'm actually diving into Mormonism. Which is not the way you should do historical research, but since I've already added all these other books on Mormonism, I figured I could also add this one because, it's a new one. So there you have it. Me not being academically good. American Zion, A New History of Mormonism by Benjamin E. Park. And it comes out on the 30th of January, which is Tuesday. So now you have it. Well, John, have fun. I hope you're riding dinosaurs today, because that's the only way to play video games. Yeah, there's always the South Park guys, I know. Well, we're running up to the 2-hour time limit. The question is like, how many of you are actually still there, and how many of you want to go to bed? Because it's, I don't want to bore the last two of you with me getting drunk in front of a camera. Although I know that Biggest is totally up for that. So we might, slowly phase it out, because this beer is also running out. And, the usual thing. It's just one of those things that I can't see how many people are actually watching. So I have to judge audience by looking at the number of comments. You read the Cosmere as anti-capitalist? Now, that's an interesting one. I mean, from what I can tell, there was, and that's sort of like part of what makes Mormonism, as like from a historical perspective, interesting, is that it starts out with ideas of communalism, and pooling everyone's earnings and stuff like that, and then further retreating from that with every generation of prophets and so forth, until the Mormons have certainly become a very, very capitalist society themselves. Awesome, Ori. I approve of double watching in that regard. All right, see you around, Biggest, and yeah, go read some more McDonald. But I think that's a good idea. Then we're closing into like 2 hours of a stream, and my beer's empty. This is the beginning of the year. I'll try to have like a guest for the next one. I'm still figuring out who and so forth. As I said, like in one of these videos I did recently, is like I want to invite booktubers that are not part of the usual suspects to broaden everyone's horizon, including mine. So if you have suggestions of people I should totally ask to come on and talk to, you can always let me know. yeah, I'll ask Keanu Reeves if he has time to get drunk with me online. I think that's sounds like a reasonable plan. No, you don't have to spoil that, Daniel. I'm as I said, I'm going to read a lot of Cosmere this year, and I'll be happy to find out how anti-capitalist it is. I mean, we'll see. I'll disagree or agree with it later this year. I'll start out with Elantris. That's the word. I'll start out with Elantris I don't know, in a week or two when I'm done with my Mormon prelude. I still haven't figured out whether I should make a video on Mormonism or just use it as background knowledge and drop it in, because I don't know if anyone's actually interested into like an introduction into Mormonism by an amateur. All right, that's the end of that beer. I guess what I'll do is I'll open this one and say cheers to you all. Then I'll slowly fade into the dark. Well, no, I don't, because I don't know how to do fade effects on this streaming thing. But here's the beer, and cheers for everyone who actually showed up. I do very much appreciate that. Starts of the year are always rough for me, so having you guys show up and talk to and stuff like that does mean a lot to me. It's you know, it's fun. And it gives me like another reason to just talk. And as we all know, that's like the only thing I can do, right? All right. As said, have a good night. Thanks for showing up. I hope you had fun. I certainly did. And I'll see you with like a video on something. I don't know. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after tomorrow. Who knows? I have ideas. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you. Cheers.